Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this wonderful panel on civil rights for the JFK 100 conference. Before I introduce Dean Archon Fung, I was tasked to share a little bit about myself and my experience here so far at the Kennedy School. I'm the grandson of a farmer from Mississippi. He grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, and he lived his entire life never knowing how to read and write. He died in 2006, still never knowing how to read and write. He got into an altercation with a white store owner in 1953, Mississippi, deep in Mississippi. And because of that altercation, had to leave in the back of a trunk of a car in a funeral procession, leaving out of the state. That was his only way for him to escape what he saw as something that was unjust. Now, fortunately, because of his bravery, I'm standing here in front of you. I would not be here without that incident. And to me, his fight for civil rights, his fight to improve things for his family, has truly inspired me to be someone who's interested in reducing mass incarceration and improving the interactions that individuals have with law enforcement, police guards, and other members who sort of safeguard our security. And it's not lost on me that the conversations surrounding civil rights in this country, the conversations that we are about to have today, it's not just a matter of laws or pieces of paper that's passed through some legislature. These discussions impact people. They impact people because now there are students here that are community organizers, sons and daughters of single moms, single parents, including the grandson of a uneducated farmer from Mississippi. And I don't want you all to lose sight of that, to lose sight of the impact of this discussion and why these discussions are so important, because there are so many people that did not make it out of Mississippi. There's so many people that are still struggling around the country because segregation didn't stop. It evolved, it became more complex, it became more intricate. People are still living segregated lives, not only in the South, but in New England, in the Midwest, and in the West Coast. And I hope that you all come to that conclusion. In terms of what I want to do, in terms of using this experience at the Kennedy School, I'm graduating in May. In addition to a master in a public policy degree at the Kennedy School, I have, as of last Thursday, just received my JD from the University of Washington School of Law. But I'm getting ready to start a career working at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law in DC as an attorney. And my project will actually be using impact litigation to eliminate debtors' prisons as a way to reduce mass incarceration and improve the interactions that young black men like my grandfather have with law enforcement. And so with that story, I hope that you all take something from that. I hope that you're encouraged. But I hope you know that there's still work to do. And so with that, I'm so honored and pleased to introduce Dean Archon Fung, who is the Academic Dean and Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Citizenship at the Harvard Kennedy School. His research explores policies, practices, and institutional designs that deepen the quality of democratic governance. He focuses upon public participation, deliberation, and transparency. And he co-directs the Transparency Policy Project and leads democratic governance programs of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation here at the Kennedy School. His books include Full Disclosure, The Perils and Promise of Transparency, and Empowered Participation, Reinventing Urban Democracy. He has authored 5 books, 4 detailed collections, and over 50 articles appearing in professional journals. It is my honor and privilege to present you Dean Archon Fung. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll remain seated since we're going to do this as a Q&A and discussion. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's breakout session on civil rights and activism since the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Certainly one of the most important legacies of the Kennedy era is civil rights activism and the enduring effect of that activism on government, law, public policy, and American society. Indeed, it may be fair to say that the American progressive imagination stands on two pillars. One is the New Deal, and the second is the civil rights movement. We're here to examine the promise and challenges faced by some of the contemporary inheritors of the civil rights movement. We have four fantastic panelists here to engage in that discussion with us. I'll go kind of from, I guess, your right to left. First is Maria Teresa Kumar, who is the founding president and CEO of Voto Latino. She's an Emmy-nominated contributor to MSNBC. Under her leadership, Voto Latino has become a key actor in national elections by registering over 250,000 voters. She's a frequent guest analyst on NPR and PBS, a panelist on Bill Maher's HBO show, an opinion writer for national publications. She speaks regularly at major conferences, including South by Southwest, Netroots Nation, the Personal Democracy Forum, and TEDx. She started her career as a legislative aide for then Democratic Caucus Chair Vic Fazio. She is a Kennedy School grad, welcome back, and also attended University of California at Davis. Next is Aisha Moodie-Mills, who is president and CEO of Victory Fund and Victory Institute, which is the nation's largest resource for openly LGBTQ public officials. So it's kind of like Emily's List a little bit. She'll explain the similarities and differences, but for LGBTQ officials. Her team is dedicated to developing careers and leadership potential of thousands of Victory Institute program participants and Victory Fund endorsed candidates who fight for LGBTQ equality and opportunity. Prior to joining Victory Fund, she was a senior fellow and director of the FIRE Initiative at the Center for American Progress. And Aisha began her career in education policy and nonprofit management at the Center for Education Reform. She holds 2 degrees from University of Maryland, College Park, an MBA from the Robert H. Smith School of Business, and a bachelor's degree in psychology. To her right is, or your right, is T.W. Shannon, who is currently a fellow at our Institute of Politics. He made history by becoming the youngest speaker from my home state, Oklahoma, and their House of Representatives, as well as the first Chickasaw Nation and first African American to hold that post. As Oklahoma's Speaker of the House, he was the first African American Republican in the country to head a legislative body since Reconstruction. Before serving in the legislature, T.W. worked as Chief Administrative Officer at the Chickasaw Nation, and he's chairman of the Future Majority Project, which is a group of the Republican State Legislative Committee that is dedicated to recruiting diverse candidates across the country to run for office at the state level. T.W. has a J.D. from Oklahoma City University and a B.A. in Communication from Cameron University. And last but certainly not least is our very own Leah Wright Rigueur, who is an assistant professor of public policy and history here at the Kennedy School. She received her BA in history from Dartmouth and her MA and PhD in history from Princeton. Before joining the Kennedy School, Leah was a professor at Wesleyan University, and her research interests include 20th century U.S. political and social history, modern African American history. Her work emphasizes race, civil rights, political ideology, and the American two-party system. Her first book, which is fantastic, everybody should read it, is The Loneliness of the Black Republican, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2015. And it covers more than 4 decades of American political and social history, examining the situation and the evolution of black political activism and its relationship to the Republican Party. Okay, so my substantive introduction is going to be a little demanding, so pay some close attention for about the next 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so in the civil rights era, many would say that the injustice that civil rights was about was fairly obvious. It was de jure and de facto racial segregation in the South. Civil rights mobilization and demonstration had the purpose of pointing out, among others, to the white majority that a black minority was facing very seriously unjust laws and social conditions. So think about Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail is an appeal to his colleagues, but also to the white majority to say, look, the laws that you have made and are enforcing all over America, but especially in the South, are unjust, and you should change them. And that will make an America that is more desirable and more just, not only for black people, but for everyone in America, because that is what we strive to do, right? And so they're appealing to a majority to say, hey, we're getting the short end of the stick, you should fix it, right? You should fix it with us. That's kind of the whole theory of civil disobedience. Now, there's a lot of civil rights activism today, but it's of a different character in this respect. It's not clear who is getting the short end of the stick. So we live in an age when many different groups feel that they are being treated unjustly. And I want to talk for a moment about white conservatives who feel that they are being treated unjustly. And I want to quote from Arlie Hochschild, who has written this fantastic book, Strangers in Their Own Land, which is an ethnography of Tea Party supporters, grassroots activists in Louisiana who are conservative people. And her method is to come up with a kind of fable, a story that reflects how these folks are experiencing their lives, and to say it back to them and say, have I gotten it right? Do you see your world this way? And they say yes. This is her deep story that she constructs. You are in a long line that leads to the top of a mountain. At the end of the line is something that you really want, the American dream. You feel a sense of great deserving. You've worked very hard. A lot of these guys, the guys that she's studying, were plant workers, pipe fitters in the petrochemical industry, tough work. So you've worked really hard. But the line isn't moving. It's like a pilgrimage up to the top, and it's not moving. And then you see some people cut in line. Who are they? They are affirmative action women who would go to formerly all men's jobs, or affirmative action blacks who've been sponsored and now have access to formerly all white jobs. It's immigrants, it's refugees, and as felt to you, the line is even moving backwards. And then you're in line and you see Barack Hussein Obama, who should be impartially monitoring the line to make sure nobody's cutting. But in fact, he's waving the line cutters in. And you think, oh my God, he's their president, not mine. And in fact, he himself is a line cutter. What a minute, what's going on here? And then, she writes, these people begin to feel like strangers in their own land. They feel like the government has become a giant marginalization machine. It's not their government. In fact, it's putting them back. And it feels, then someone in front of the line turns around and says, hey, you redneck, you know. And then it feels like it's adding insult to injury. That's the tipping point in which people begin to feel really, really estranged and culturally denigrated. And then the economy begins to shake. And then they feel, I need another leader. Okay. Now, that creates a profound challenge in which some people in the room may agree with that deep story and it may resonate with them. I think probably it's likely that many, many people in the room will find that deep story factually completely implausible. But the fact is, many people do feel like it resonates with them and reflects their life situation. And that creates a profound challenge for civil rights movements today, because a large part of the civil rights movement, as with any social movement, was to mobilize its own supporters. But another important aim of the civil rights movement, as with any successful social movement, is to persuade those who disagree with them. They can't, by definition, a social movement advocating for minority rights can't prevail in a democracy unless it convinces a bunch of other people. Okay, so the first question, and this goes to the whole panel, is that in your own work with Latino voters, LGBT candidates, hardworking families in the rural areas and cities of Norman and other places of Oklahoma and other places in the middle of the country, How do you weigh the amount of effort that you spend mobilizing your own supporters, your own base, kind of getting them organized, advocating for them and with them, versus convincing people who disagree with you that your group should be treated more fairly, that you're suffering injustice? So it's the balance between mobilization and then having a conversation with people who disagree. Yeah. Go ahead, María.
Sure. So I think first of all, I think to frame it, I think that there has been we're reliving in American history that we have already lived before. And what I mean by that, 100 years ago, you could have basically very easily have had that same conversation with white rural Americans who felt that they were disenfranchised because the Irish and the Polish and the Italians were coming in and taking their jobs. At the same time, we had a huge, massive industrial revolution. We had a Great Depression, and we were on brink of war, finishing up war. And what we decided to do as Americans, we did a gut check, and we recognized that we were going to double down on ourselves. And we decided that we were going to fund the GI Bill. We were going to create a middle class. We were going to lay down fiber optics that later became the internets, as I like to say. We decided that we were actually going to connect the country with an interstate highway. We decided that we were going to go to the moon 60 years later. We decided to double down on who we were and who our character is. What we have right now is we are at the same crossroads in this country. Who is American was really the deciding factor of this election. That was the question. Who is deserving of the future of this country? And so when you ask what is it that Voto Latino does, we definitely work very much on trying to attract and bring the Latino community on board. But I learned about 4 years into the work that it was almost impossible to do that if I did not have conversations with mainstream America. And so we, as a tactic, started informing Americans about fellow Americans. How many folks here realize American Latinos are the second largest group of Americans?
Really?
I would say that it was about a third of the room, and we're the biggest audience to ever raise their hand to say that. We're not only we're second largest community, but 60% of our community is 33 years or younger. So when you start talking about a massive demographic shift, we're not kidding. And they're coming into communities where historically you have not seen people of color, let alone Latinos. John Edwards always liked to campaign saying that he was from a small mill town in the South. That same small town in the South is now 51% Latino. Huh. That's massive. And so instead of having leadership that basically was explaining the demographic changes of our country, we instead got a leadership that basically went to our lowest common denominator and saying that what we do as Americans is impossible to actually build our communities. When you start asking why so many folks feel, and imagine if I were to go down a laundry list of what is happening right now in America, and I start talking to you about food deserts, I start talking to you about lack of jobs, I start talking to you about this idea of lack of education, opportunity for your kids, lack of health care, a drug epidemic. You can close your eyes and I can be talking very much about the urban poor or the rural poor. It's the same community. And I could bet you money that if I'm talking to a 27-year-old woman who has a child in both those communities, it doesn't matter the color of their skin. At the same time, what happened in this election is that they were talking very much about this disenfranchisement of the American community, and not recognizing that what we're experiencing right now is severe generational ties generational divisions. When folks were saying, well, why did 53% of white women vote against their interest? Because there was an economic message that was resonating. The majority of American whites are 53 years old. The majority of Latinos are closer to 18. So if you start talking to, the only message that you're talking to in general about women is this idea of choice, you're not resonating with the 53-year-old woman who basically may have lost her home in the Great Recession. Her husband has not been able to adapt his skill set to the future labor force. And her millennial son is living at home. Her future hasn't gotten better. The closest and easiest common denominator to say is blame your neighbor. The hard work is to recognize that you need a generation of Americans that are up, that are young, that are coming, that are going to help fuel our economy and our future. And so when we start talking, and one of the biggest challenges I think that we have right now as Americans is that people kept saying, especially with this election, folks kept saying, oh, they played too much on identity politics. It's not identity politics when we're talking about civil rights. And we can't confuse the two. We can't have a thriving America if all of a sudden someone feels less than because they can't choose who they marry, or if they can't control when they choose to have a family, or if they can't choose who and when they decide to be Americans. And let's be clear, November 8th for American Latinos was incredibly hopeful. We saw the biggest participation rates that we've ever seen. It was the only group that actually grew electorally. November 9th, our world changed. It was a different America, physically. You can talk to any Latino, whether they voted for this administration or not, and there is not one who does not have to have a conversation with their child because all of a sudden they feel that they're being bullied, or goes into a professional setting and people cross lines asking whether or not they're American. And that is where we are. We as Americans have to decide who are we, and are we preparing the future to ensure that we are not only, and I have to say, one of the things that the speeches that really resonated with me that we had in the opening ceremony was, that Kennedy said is, when we start talking about this idea of peace, what kind of peace that we want? The kind of peace that makes life worth living here on Earth. So it's not enough just to be tolerant of each other. It's about having accepting and actually seeing the possibility of what it means. And I think that we are the only country that's amply prepared for multiculturalism in a multicultural global world. There is this sense that oftentimes that we aren't ready for certain moments, and I actually think that we are deeply prepared for what's next, but it's doing the hard work now of finding who we are again and reminding ourselves that we've been through this before, imperfectly, because I think that we are still aspiring to that perfection of the founding fathers. But if we recognize what our fundamentals are, and that we have always been a multiracial country, we have always been a nation fundamentally of immigrants, we should be actually beyond this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Aisha.
So I want to actually comment on 1,000 things that Teresa just said, which I think was beautiful and eloquent. But I'll try to come a little bit back to your question just from a LGBT lens. You know, the community of people that you opened up talking about who see others as line cutters and see others as imposters, essentially, in their America, are the same group of people that see LGBTQ people in America as imposters and as line cutters and as people who are not deserving and who aren't welcome. And I think that, you know, one of the things the movement, the LGBT equality movement has done so successfully over the last 20, 30 years is really focused on our common humanity. And starting from the common denominator of us as people, not as an other, but who are we as just neighbors? So the entire frame of the National Coming Out Project, which was really about people like me just standing up and saying, hey, I'm here, and I know you may think something of me because of the color of my skin or perhaps because of my gender, but by the way, I also happen to be a lesbian and you know me, and it humanizes me, and we share things in common, and we're neighbors, and we're connected, has been the crux of the success of the LGBT movement, which goes a lot to what Maria Teresa was saying. Is how can we connect in a way that's around just dignity and respect and values and who we are in our neighborhoods and in our communities. And that does become trying when you're talking about opposition, right? When you're talking about people who fundamentally, for religious reasons or otherwise, don't believe that you should exist, believe that you're going to hell, believe that your lifestyle is vile. It's tough to break through and say, I'm human, when you fundamentally don't believe that I'm who I am and that matters and that I'm worthy of love and of praise. But I think that just simply what we have seen success in is just simply showing up at the kitchen table has been the beginning of culture shift in families. It's been the experience in my family. I come from a black Southern, I'm from South Carolina. My people are all from South Carolina. They're all Christian. They all preach. Everybody's a preacher. Everybody's pastoring some church or another. And certainly being an out lesbian was not top of mind for folks as, like, you know, the most successful person in the family should not be a lesbian. But it really just took showing up at church and kind of being who I was and bringing my then girlfriend, but now wife, to events that started to break down this stereotype and mythology about what does it mean to even be LGBT, and to get rid of some of that taboo. Because when people see you and know you as the cousin who's just successful and lives in the big city, then they can get over their isms, and they can't justify why we should treat you differently than we treat everybody else, especially since we're proud of you and we believe in you. And that has been, that humanizing, that just having the courage to show up authentically as who you are, has really been the foundation of the LGBT movement. I'm going to talk all about the politics and the issues and like what we're doing to drive equality forward, et cetera. But that piece of it, I think, has really been what, the shoulders of the giants that we all stand on. People have literally put their livelihoods, their lives, their safety on the line to just walk through the world authentically, move through their families authentically. That has been demystifying. That has broken down barriers. That has been, and I talked to so many other movements. In fact, there's some dreamers who said, well, we were, before this administration, on a coming out kind of sense of project, coming out as undocumented.
Right.
I talked to women who've had abortions who say, well, we think that if we start maybe coming out a little bit more about having an abortion, kind of in the way that the gays did about being who they are, then that will demystify some of the stereotype and normalize and humanize who we are and get rid of some of this vile bigotry and hostility. And so that is what I'm most proud of the movement. It's brought us to a place where we have now, as LGBT people, at least for a decade or so, I'd say we've been winning the culture war, if you will.
Yes.
80% of Americans believe that LGBT people should have basic civil rights, and have for about a decade. Now, we can't get a bill passed in Congress, and that's about politics and lots of other things, and the political system and the legislative system are often a lagging indicator of where Americans actually are. But most people think that I already am protected from discrimination in the workplace, and that it's illegal to fire me from my job simply because I'm a lesbian. But it's not. But most people just assume that it should be because we live in the United States of America, and no matter who you are, you should be able to put a picture up of your spouse and not get fired because you got married the weekend before and you come in on Monday with the picture. But that's not the case. And so we are winning from a cultural standpoint because we worked through the humanization. Now where our fight is in the political spectrum. And that's where we really get to the how do you deal with people who vehemently oppose you from a policy perspective. Some of these folks are people who love you and embrace you as a human being, right? See you at church every Sunday and say, I love you because the Lord says that I should love you. I love you as a person. I may not love what you do, but I love you as a person, but I'm going to fight against your rights. And that has been a real interesting and difficult nut to crack, frankly. One of the reasons why I think that we are still having a tough time, especially in state legislatures, but we are widely underrepresented serving in legislative bodies as LGBT people. That gets to you have to have someone in the body who can speak through the lens of being gay to actually speak truth to power and speak to their colleagues and say, are you really going to pass a nasty measure that is going to hurt my family when you're sitting next to me and you know me? We don't have a lot of people at the table. And as Barney Frank, we're in Massachusetts, as Congressman Barney Frank used to say, when we are not at the table, we're on the menu. And we see that happen time and time again. And so while we're winning the culture war, we're losing politically still in many ways because we don't have many LGBT people serving in Congress. We only have 7. We don't have many people serving around this country in state legislatures. We don't have many mayors. We don't have people in city council, et cetera. And so I think that the way we go to really face our opponents and like literally get into the faces of our opponents from a policy perspective is to actually put our people at the policy-making tables so that they can be there in the middle of the debates and they can be there having the conversations that need to be had. Because what we know and what has worked for 20 and 30 years is that once you know someone who is LGBT, you start to soften a little bit. At the very least, you can't justify attempts to harm them, do them harm. And so the work that we do at the Victory Institute and the work that we do at the Victory Fund is really about getting more leadership in place to be at those tables where it matters so that we can be a part of that decision-making process.
Great, thank you. So one thing to pay attention to in these conversations about contemporary social movements is some of the techniques that different social movements use, and scholars, social movement scholars call this the repertoire of different social movements. And at different times, different tactics are appropriate, right? And so the hallmark of the 1960s civil rights movement is the lunch counter sit-in or the public demonstration. And so very different for the LGBTQ movement. Coming out was a key kind of thing to really shift how people thought about the whole phenomenon and gay people, and as you say, had a very powerful influence on culture. And so the techniques change because the problems change, what the social movements are after change, but also because the times change. And we'll talk about that in social media in a little while. TW.
You know, to kind of add voice to some of the other comments that were already made, when we talk about kind of that rural voter, you know, this place, being a fellow at the Kennedy School this semester, right after the election, has been a real interesting process. As I understand, I wasn't here for the election, but I imagine it was a pretty dark day here at the Kennedy School, just based on my interactions with students who have come in, and it's honestly been, you know, I felt like a Catholic priest at times, and coming into kind of confessionals, both Republicans and Democrats, kind of laying it all out, and it's been an amazing experience. But one of the things I've taken away from that experience, and what I've tried to communicate, because that rural working voter, that's who elected me. I know that constituency very well. And what I've tried to communicate to students as they communicate to me, because what I heard them say was, when I woke up the night after the election, I didn't recognize this country. This was a different country than I thought that I lived in. I didn't recognize the people, I didn't recognize the country. And to lend voice to that conservative rural voter, what I wanted them to know was, when you talk to that conservative rural voter, they felt that exact same way the last 10 years, every single day of their life. And so to put it into context, it's a great place for empathy. You know, politics is the art of finding things that you agree with people on and moving forward on those issues. And when we talk about the letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King, in his brilliance, as he was appealing to a conservative group who had united behind the idea of, quote, unity, because they were concerned about, you know, the activity that was happening in the streets of Birmingham. And he was appealing to them not on race, not on gender, not on anything else other than this higher ideal, this idea that we have a moral right to stand up for what's wrong. And he was able to move the public by that. Now, he also used, obviously, multimedia efforts. He was a genius at that as well. And I don't think that that's changed. I think we've only, I think we have all, those of us that are in leadership positions in the public square, have all learned from that movement. And one of the implications that we've had, and I know we're going to talk about a little later, is social media. I think the impact that social media has had has been tremendous. I mean, when you're an elected official, and it's amazing as the speaker. You know, when I'm the Speaker of the House, I don't have time to, you know, really sit down with every single member and understand their political ideology and their religious beliefs. I've got 4 months. I've got to pass a budget. My Constitution says I have to pass a balanced budget by the last day in May. And so I'm all about finding ways that we agree and how can we get this done. And what we have found is I was always surprised by the number of members who would come to me and say, Mr. Speaker, I can't vote for this budget. I've had 100 people contact me. I mean, there are 100 people who tell me this budget is going to, you know, starve children, and, you know, there'll be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And I would kindly remind that member, you represent 36,000 people. You know, 100 people who decided to email you, I don't exactly classify that as a movement. However, it was still such a new medium, and I still think it is. I think we're still sorting out what that means. And so my point is, the tools that we have now are so much greater than even those that were available, and how we make our appeal known. And I think that's really where the Tea Party movement was birthed. It was this idea that government has become so big that we have to take it back for ourselves and recognize that we, the people, are the ones that actually call the shots. And right or wrong, I think it was a pretty effective movement to a degree of making elected officials recognize that the people you represent have a real voice. And so while there aren't as many demonstrations that get as much attention as maybe the 1960s, we have a different arsenal of tools. And regardless of what your your political persuasion is, those tools are accessible and they're quite effective. I'm amazed at how effective that they really are. And so as we think about moving forward and how we can continue to keep our republic in place, I think it's doing what those around state legislatures have to do every year, and that's find things that you agree on. There are a lot of things that we disagree with, but there has to be a common theme of Americanism that we can find to agree on, and I think it still exists. It just takes thoughtful leaders who are willing to engage in those conversations.
Yeah, so first, thank you all for having me here today. And I think one of the things that might be useful is contextualizing a little bit this idea of social movements in history, particularly thinking about King. And I think we have this idea of King and thinking about the success of the modern civil rights movement. But at the time, right, and if we look at that moment in time, it's not a popular movement, right? There's not a lot of support for it. It's an incredibly violent movement that is going against the grain. And I think part of what comes out in King's writing, both in the letter from Birmingham jail, but also in some of his speeches, particularly towards the later stages of his life, is the idea of justice, right? And that justice is not easy, that democracy is not easy, that democracy is fragile and is something that has to be reconstituted, revised, and fought over and over and over again. So I think it's important, and really thinking about that when we think about where we are right now. So the other thing that I think to those ends, when we're thinking about democracy and when we're thinking about kind of ideas of social movements and civil rights movements, is to really think about the people who are in these different silos. One thing that I think, if you've been at the Kennedy School long enough, you've heard this saying over and over again, but equality feels a lot like oppression to people who have been on top, right? And this is not a new story, right? This is not something that is unique to 2017. It's not something, it's something that we see again and again, to Maria's point, but also thinking about these moments that we feel, that we think of as incredibly democratic moments, right? Like the GI Bill. Ooh. Oh, okay. There's still moments where the idea of democracy and the idea of equality is still something that is contested and is continually being fought over, especially as people continue to be excluded. I think it's a lot to ask people who continually have been excluded, who are marginalized, who are vulnerable, to be empathetic to people who don't necessarily hold the same empathy for them. And in fact, Arlie Hochschild had a very good discussion about this. With that said, though, part of what I think we need to see in the present as we think about the next phase of these civil rights movements is to have these strong visionary leaders, right? Not necessarily figureheads, but people who are actually invested in leading and doing and thinking to actually translate what lies beneath, right? This kind of lack of empathy, disconnect, polarization. But I think particularly ideas of rage or resentment or fear. Now, there are very real truths, right, about marginalized people in, I think, our nation that we can kind of bear out in macroeconomics or something like that. But the truth is, too, that some of this fear, some of this resentment, a lot of this polarization, that what lies underneath are people who see their very world changing around them. Right? So there has to be a way to translate what's underneath and then access that. And I think this is what I think visionary leaders and leadership does and is supposed to do, and thinkers. I think this is especially true as we think about our nation as a place where on the very upper levels, we see an incredible amount of success, an incredible amount of progress. But the way that translates into people's lives doesn't necessarily line up with a pure economic picture. Right? So it's still possible to be, right, so making over the median income or have wealth and to be privileged, but still be on the margins of society, right? and feel as if you're on the margins, but actually be on the margins as well. And so we have to find some way to be able to tap into that in a language that is not based on exclusion, that is not based on discrimination, that is not based on, I think, rage and resentment. And so I think one of the things that I talk to my students a lot in class is about this idea of a pragmatic utopian vision of America and of the nation, right? So it means having the vision to ask for what you want, right? Freedom, equality, right? Particularly economic equality and addressing economic inequality, but also being pragmatic enough to be strategic about how you address this. So whether it be through these various social movements, whether it be through people who work within existing systems, whether it be through negotiators, whether it be through agitators, right? Particularly when we think about protesters, I think we can look at history, we can look at right now and say that even negotiators need protesters, right? They need somebody on the outside. And so I think really one of the questions that we should be thinking about in moving forward is how do we strengthen democracy? How do we rethink and revitalize democracy? But also how do we think creatively and imaginatively in ways that speak to the reality of people on the ground?
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to individual panelists, and then we'll open it up. And the first theme I want to explore a little bit is the interaction between people in social movements and politicians, right? And it's always tense. You know, famously, you know, both Kennedy, both Jack and Bobby, as well as Lyndon Johnson, after them had pretty tense relationships at times with leaders of the civil rights movement. I remember, you know, Bill Clinton had the famous exchange with AIDS Act Up activists, in which he said, you know, I've done so much for you people. So there was a little
That was
tension.
beautifully done.
Yeah, a little tension there. And that's appropriate because social movements are out there to push and politicians are out there to explore what is going on? Explore the space of the doable, the tenable, right? And so this is first a question for TW is, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with Tea Party activists in Oklahoma, and in particular, you know, one high point and one low point? When have they been kind of most supportive, and when has it been a little bit tense, if you're willing to share that?
You know, the Tea Party movement, again, birthed out of this idea that government has gotten too small, has gotten too large, and it's inaccessible because of its size. And Oklahoma, of course, being probably the most conservative state in the union, it was interesting when the Tea Party movement kind of developed to recognize that, you know, the average person in Oklahoma was already there. We were already, we already thought the government was too big. We already thought the government shouldn't go poking its nose. When I knocked on doors, you know, when I knocked on 8,000 doors in 2007, the thing I heard three things at the door. They said, fix our roads, fix our schools, and leave us alone. Those were the three things that I heard at the door. And so when the Tea Party movement, if you will, came along, and these self-professed leaders of the Tea Party movement developed, it was an interesting dichotomy in that we were already with them. The Oklahoma legislature was already fighting to, you know, for personal liberty. This idea that personal responsibility and personal liberty were important tenements of who we were. And so when you had a group that tried to formulate, it was hard for them to get real traction when the people were already with them. So, you know, we certainly had moments where I visited Tea Party rallies, if you will, Tea Party groups. It was interesting when they kind of self-excluded themselves from the greater masses of people who were already on the issues pretty close to where they were anyway. A high moment, I don't know that there were high moments because again, it was hard for the movement to start in Oklahoma. Again, when the people are already, you know, ready to reduce the size of government, if you will. So low moment, certainly I ran for United States Senate, and I actually received some support from some national leaders who identified as, you know, kind of Tea Party-esque, if you will. And it was this interesting dichotomy when some self-professed leaders of the local Tea Party had their ideas for a different candidate. And it was, that was an intense moment, but that candidate eventually went away, and those same folks eventually got on board. But I believe that, again, the idea of where the Tea Party started and then where it evolved from a media standpoint there's a lot of room left there for improvement, to be honest.
Good, very good. So last question before I open it up. I want to explore barbershops and churches and the internet briefly. So social movements, the successful ones, oftentimes are connected to the places in society where their community really gathers. And so for the civil rights movement, famously it was churches, black churches in the South, and then Stonewall in New York City, right? For LGBT. And I think that a big part of the success of the conservative social movement in America is because there is a there there. There are conservative evangelical churches, there are gun clubs, there's a real there. That's at some tension with the idea of the internet and social media. And so it's a question for Maria Teresa first, and other people might want to chime in, is where do you see the constituencies gathering? Is it a there, like churches and barbershops, like in the old days, or you don't think about it like that because it's on the internet and it's more virtual? Like, where's the community?
I think that first of all, I actually think that and it extends, and this last election shows that they are no longer just hubs in evangelicals, but they are hubs also within the social platforms. And I think one of the challenges right now and I am in media, but I think one of the challenges right now is the fact that everybody just consumes the media they like. And so there is no conversations that are happening that are real. Sometimes folks say, well, the president's doing X, but tweeting this. And it's like, well, because his constituency is only reading his tweets and watching a certain news channel, so they don't have to cross-check anything he's actually doing. There's a danger in that because there's not transparency. So I would say that the challenge right now that we're finding is penetrating those places. The only place that we've found that people are still in America communicating and tuning in at the same time are radio stations and the evening news, your local evening news. So we have a direct strategy of actually going in and having those conversations. Now, as far as places of mobilization, from the very beginning, Voto Latino was an online strategist. We started organizing, for folks who may remember, MySpace. Thank you. We actually started organizing on MySpace and helped promote the first immigration marches that were, at the time, the largest civil rights marches of our nation's history back in 2006. And it was bringing in people that were like-minded across the country together and helping with creating walkouts, because government was about to sign the most stringent legislation of who was going to be able to access government resources based on status. What we saw in the next 10 years was, first we saw these marches, then we saw marches for Occupy Wall Street, we saw marches for LGBTQ, we saw marches for the environment, we saw marches for choice. More recently, we saw marches for Black Lives Matter that culminated, you could say, it was all the exact same people marching for the exact same thing for 10 years that culminated in the Women's March of intersectionality. And so for a long time, people started finding themselves in marches. That was the new barbershop. But within the Latino community, it's fundamentally, and still very much is, the space of radio, bilingual radio. That's where we actually identified and cultivated, back in 2004, we started cultivating young radio DJs to go into clubs, and they were doing our voter registration efforts. It's counterintuitive, but what we found is that by making sure that we had a young leader that had airwaves that were free, we're a nonprofit, and that would basically talk to them on Monday through Friday, see them at the club on Saturday, register them to vote. We would register folks within an hour at 60 to 70 people in an hour. To appreciate it, it usually takes, through traditional methods, 45 minutes to an hour to register one person just by knocking on the door. So for us, it was identifying, because we focused specifically on the children of immigrants. So we were identifying where they were. So we also worked very closely with college campuses, fraternities and sororities. Absent and if you were to say, well, where do the parents congregate? Unions have been a massive piece of the puzzle for us in order to organize, because they are the new bloodstream for the unions. But breaking into this idea of who and who doesn't belong, from the very beginning, we've identified the internet and Twitter and Facebook because, and this is just so for folks to understand, the parents are watching Univision. They're watching Telemundo. These young people are American kids going to American schools, speaking English predominantly, do not read Spanish, may understand it at best. So our tactic from the very beginning was going on, creating partnerships with YouTube, creating partnerships with Twitter, with Spotify, because these young people were going on the internet to find people that understood that they were speaking English, that were culturally attuned. And so the internet still is very much a place for, so young African Americans and Latinos were the first adopters of Twitter. And that was because they had already been using, and again, they were using the T-Mobile Sidekick. Nobody remembers that. But it was like literally like this big, and it was a brick. But it gave them internet access. So you could argue that inner city youth, for the most part, were the first to actually have access to internet and as a place. And they were used to talking in 140 characters or less. So, wow. They were natives.
I didn't prep you. Can I ask you the same question? I mean, what is there a place like a barbershop, or is it the internet for LGBT constituents? I mean, it's obviously a big, diverse group. But.
Sure, and it's more disaggregated now for sure, but I mean, historically our movement was in the clubs. I mean, that's where the first riot started, Stonewall. I mean, that's where we could go and we could be safe, was at the bars. That's where we could find our people. And so, Dean, can I come back to something that you were asking earlier?
Yes.
So I don't want us to lose this conversation that we started, where you were asking about the tension between elected officials and the people, and the people. I work, so the other side of our work, Victory Institute is our C3. We train LGBT people to serve in government, to run for office, to get appointments, et cetera, because it matters that they're there. The other piece of that work that I do is I run Victory Fund, which is our political action arm. And one of the things that we tend not to really deeply explore when we talk about civil rights and transformation in America is the actual politics of how we win. And at the end of the day, I believe that Dr. King's legacy has brought us all to a place where we are much better today than we were 50 years ago. I think that we are continuing to win the culture war of inclusion, of people believing in the values of justice. But we're losing politically. And that's something that gets to that tension between the values of the people who are marching and who are tweeting. And let's be reminded that the values of justice and civil rights and inclusivity and economic security, ultimately, for all people, prevailed in November on Election Day. And the candidate who supported those values won by 3 million votes, almost, but lost. And so the tension that we have with winning in the streets and winning in the values and winning as it relates to the movements and bringing people along is that the politicians don't necessarily have to respond and react to the majority sentiment, because the way that the political structure is designed is that it's set up where they can really just listen to the 5 people who read their tweets. Their districts are gerrymandered in a way where they're already kind of preaching to the choir, they're already speaking to people who agree with them. Those folks may be the vast minority, but they're the only people that they need to win. And so we have to figure out how do we, which is, what your question was, we have to really figure out how do we win the political spectrum? Because I believe that the vast majority of people, and this is just my opinion and from me having conversations with some of our more conservative constituents, because at Victory we actually have significant gay Republicans who are supporters of our organization. I would, just talking to them, I would imagine that the vast majority of Americans don't believe that Latino families should be broken up, and that 3-year-old children should be left without their parents because we decide that we want to deport and ship off their mother. That's not humane. No one would say, oh yeah, that's right, we should do that, break up those families, right?
Steve King says that, but that's and tweets
because
about it,
Steve
that's
King
fine.
is situated in a way where he does not have to buy into the empathic majority, because he just needs a couple of people to vote for him to keep him in a position of power, where, you know, unfortunately, he's able to tap into the sentiments of bigotry and hostility, which I believe are the minority in this country, but still win. And so the question for me and why I do the work on the political side is, how do we win the politics? Because I think that we're winning in the analysis and the thoughtfulness about where we go to have criminal justice reform and what should we really be doing, right? But the people who are blocking that are the folks who only need a handful of crazy folks to win. The Tea Party sparked much of that. I mean, even with very thoughtful, smart Republicans who had been knee-deep for years in issues and the work, and were very well versed in their vision of how they thought they should be moving America forward, were derailed by folks who didn't know what they were talking about, were kind of coming to the table based on more animosity than pragmatism, as you were talking about. And those people get to win. And so as we have this conversation, I would just remind us that the political system, the way that it's designed, the way that gerrymandering has really disenfranchised the majority in some ways, has created a system where even as we are driving solutions forward and changing hearts and minds and expanding the values of civil rights and justice, we're still having a tough time on a legislative front because our political system is designed to keep the values of the majority sometimes still in a place where we can't win. So,
Archon, can I say one quick thing? So just to
Sure.
like tag on, I know we're gonna then open it up. Just to tag on to that, I think we also have to think a little bit too about this idea of non-voters, right? And so people who feel alienated from the system, particularly young people of color, right? Men of color whose turnout level I think was down by 11% in the 2016 election. Who feel like their needs and their voices aren't being heard, aren't being met by the system as it exists. And so I think this is something that really flies under the radar. There are a couple of places that have started kind of to look at these issues in depth. The Black Youth Project is an excellent resource for those people who are interested. But I do also want us to be kind of thinking, in addition to kind of how do we, as Aisha said very eloquently, how do we win at the politics, right? But how do you also bring people into the system who are alienated from it altogether, right? So it's not about
Right.
even winning or losing, but even saying that this is a system that works for me, period. Yeah.
Right. So presidential turnout in the United States is among developed kind of industrial democracies about 31 out of 35. We're near the last, and just to make that.
I know that we're going to open up, but I think that one of the things that we have to keep in mind that this was also the very first election without the Voting Rights Act. That when folks oftentimes say, well, that African American participation was depressed, I like to remind folks that over 900 voting booths went missing, 200 North Carolina alone. So it's tactical, it's infrastructure. The fact that all of a sudden you have in the classroom only 8 states require civic education in order to graduate from high school, when 51% of the folks in the classroom are children of color, disproportionately children of immigrants, it's tactical. So it's hard for us to imagine participating in a system where we don't see ourselves, hence the work that you're doing, but also we don't see ourselves institutions actually serving us. So there are structural changes that need to happen along with the gerrymandering, but also pieces that disproportionately impact people of color.
Thank you. All right, let's open it up. Stephen, if you could identify yourself and then.
First of all, it's been really wonderful. Thank you all for your thoughts, and it's very moving to hear you talk about this work and see that it's still going on. And I was struck by something that Leah said about a pragmatic utopian vision. When President Kennedy was asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said as an idealist without illusions. And also, I think TJ talked about this idea of Americanism, and you talked about this idea of civic education. And if you look at 3 of the most successful of JFK's speeches is addressed to the Houston Ministerial Association about religious discrimination, his civil rights address, and then the American University speech that we watched. They were all these appeals to kind of universal human identity, right? And so my question relates to the fact, and Arthur Schlesinger, who was an advisor and speechwriter to President Kennedy, wrote a book in the 1990s called The Disuniting of America. And what he said in the book is that people are too identified with categorical social categories identity, and that we need to kind of re-emphasize these civic ideals that are the unifying element of our character, right? Social and economic opportunity, freedom from religious discrimination, civil rights and other things. And so my question really is, are these social movements sufficiently emphasizing those things? Do you think there's an opportunity, as you said, to speak to people's common humanity through your example? Is that an avenue? How do you guys see that in terms of your role as advocates?
Every generation of Americans has struggled with this idea from the first Americans. Well, I'm part Native American, maybe not first Americans, I'm part Native American. We've had an immigration problem a long time as far as we're concerned. But this idea of we the people, right? Who's we the people? And how do we continue? Every generation of Americans is charged with expanding who we the people is. I mean, and I think that's when we talk about a movement. When We the People was written, if you were a woman, that certainly didn't include you. If you were a person of color, that didn't include you. And if you were a male who didn't own property, a white male, that didn't include you. But every generation has continued to grapple with this expansion of we the people, and no generation gets a free pass at it. And I think the work that's being done here, to answer the question directly, is it sufficient? I think in the end it will be. I think that every generation wrestles with that, and not different from the King generation. That letter he wrote to a Birmingham jail, the letter from a Birmingham jail was written to other clergymen of the South who were not necessarily professing to be in opposition. They were professing that the court was a better avenue. And I think, from Dr. King's position, he believed that, it should be addressed by the people in a legislative body. We should have legislation that encapsulates these ideals that we hold to be true. And so, yes, I think in the end it will be sufficient.
I think one of the dangers that we are facing right now in this country is that we have someone in the administration that you could argue is neither Republican or Democrat. And as a result, the challenge is trying to identify how do you actually work with someone that doesn't necessarily believe in the institutions of the values that we hold as Americans. And I know that some folks will disagree with me, but I think that the fact that we have someone who's being advised by nationalists, white nationalists, it poses incredible danger to our country, because we've never had someone at that high level, at least transparently, that had so much influence. And our job is to ensure that as we go through and we have these conversations, that we remember the reason why we're Americans, and that we believe in the institutions, and we believe in the checks and balances of the judicial system, and that we believe that there is a space for media to tell the truth and to have that transparency. I oftentimes, the challenges with the rise of the Tea Party, people kept saying, America is broken, and I kept saying, well, talk to an immigrant and they'll tell you that it's not, because they came from broken systems, and they are here because they believe in the value that they can become self-realized only in this country. And it's us forgetting that guiding light of, we may have not completed the forefathers' papers, but we are breathing them, and it's our job to make sure that we are finally coming to terms with that possibility of excellence.
Can I just briefly comment on the question about, is it sufficient? Is what we're doing sufficient? I've talked a lot about this with my LGBT community, and I give speeches about this all the time. Democracy is not necessarily a destination with a finite end. It's a process.
That's right.
It's an evolution. That's the beauty of it, that we all get to mold it and shape it. And every generation, as you were saying, gets to mold it and shape it. One of the things that came up with the LGBT movement 2 years ago, and then again last year, as we won marriage equality, is that some folks said, well, we did it. We won. We're done. We're going home. And I said, well, wait a minute. The work continues, because just as African Americans didn't pack up their bags when we got the Voting Rights Act or when we got the Civil Rights Act, and we're still fighting and we are seeing setbacks with the Voting Rights Act, we didn't pack up our bags and go home and say, look what we did, now we're done. Ask women, right? Like here we are 40-something years after Roe versus Wade. If we pack up and we go home because we hit a milestone, we don't. So, what I like to tell folks, I'd like to remind us that we are in a constant quest towards, as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. It's long, but it bends towards justice. And we are on a road and a long haul. And I don't know that any of us in our lifetimes will see finality and have won the final thing that stops the conversation and creates equality for everybody forever. But for sure, the work is meaningful because we are driving our democracy forward. And it is my hope that what we do today makes the world better in the next 50 years, just as we are standing on the shoulders of President Kennedy and of Dr. King and all that they did to make our world what it is today.
Great. Let's take a couple more questions.
Hi there. I'm Lisa Powell-Graham, and I'm a mid-career MPA from the class of 2005. Dean Archon was actually my advisor while I was here. So just contextually, I was part of Hillary Clinton's campaign staff in Philadelphia in the 2016 election and felt a sense of abject horror and despair, as I believe many people did, following the election. And there were truths that were obvious to me, that there were a lot of people's rights and lives at risk. But one of the challenges that I have encountered since then, and actually during the election process, which has been frustrating to me, and I wanted to see how you may be dealing with this in your work, is that I chose a campaign position. I was offered one in Ohio, in Trump territory, and I turned it down to be in Philadelphia. 96% of my ward voted for her. We were strong for Hillary. We turned out more votes for her than for Barack in 2012 or 2008. I needed to be in that energy, but because I didn't feel that I wasn't equipped, I didn't feel, to have conversations effectively with people whose racism or sexism was deeply entrenched in a way that I couldn't move them. The place I have found a lot of frustration during the election and post-election is the apathy of progressives. I had a lot of conversations with kind of the nickname was Bernie Bros, who were furious that Bernie was not the candidate, who refused to align with Hillary. A lot of them, in my experience, were heterosexual, middle-class white males, and there was this sense of burn the system down. Apathy about government, apathy about politics, apathy about being able to create change in the system, and just this idea that the system is broken coming from the far left. I'm regrouping, and I'm engaged politically now too, and I'm looking to be able to reach this group of progressives that became apathetic, and that for whatever reason haven't yet been able to find to me what are the obvious truths that my lesbian sister, my transgendered friends, my immigrant friends, my friends who are people of color, my reproductive rights, these are all at stake. But are you finding in your work, have you encountered that apathy amongst progressives? And are you finding ways to effectively deal with that? Because I'm grappling with that.
We'll take one more, and then we'll kind of go around and allow
White
the panel
privilege
to
is
respond.
real. I mean, that's one thing
Oh,
we
oh,
have.
wait. Let's do one more question, and then we'll kind of go around. Yeah.
Yep. Hey, my name's Andrew Snyder. I was a MPP in 2015, and Archon was also briefly my advisor, I think, in one point my first year. And after the Kennedy School, one of the experiences I had professionally was I worked actually indirectly with Maria Teresa at a tech company called TurboVote, which is a voter registration product. So if you're not registered at your current address, you can get registered there later. That's my plug because I'm not there anymore. But my question relates to digging in kind of the Voting Rights Act and the power structures that are there to prevent kind of equal access, whether it's to be registered in certain states, whether it's to be able to vote in certain states from minority communities, or kind of power structures, I guess, that you see across civil rights movements, and how are you guys in your professional work approaching dealing with such entrenched power structures, where even all of the work that you're doing, gerrymandering was also mentioned, runs into these structures. And since they tend to be rather kind of complicated to communicate to maybe somebody who's not in this room about, how do you approach that situation where you have to go and kind of explain how the game is rigged in the first place, but at the same time, you should still not be apathetic about that game?
Great. Okay, so anybody want to respond to these two questions? Why don't we just start from Leah, and then we'll come down this way for final
Sure. Those are two really big questions. And I think I'll start off briefly over here, which is that I think one of the things that comes out, that actually is apparent well before the election, is that the American two-party system, right, and our two parties are actually not just two parties, that there are multiple coalitions and there are multiple parties that exist within these two parties, and that for a very long time, right, what we imagine, say, on the left as the New Deal and the Great Society coalitions, et cetera, has in fact been disintegrating for quite some time. Right? So it comes to a head in particular when there is a candidate for whom there is not kind of a unifying force, and which allows a third party candidate to kind of move in, or an outsider candidate to kind of disrupt politics writ large. So this really happens, that we see it on both the left and the right this year. But I think ultimately one of the things that this comes down to, on the one hand, yes, there's a level of, I think, sexism, there's a level of privilege that you have to wrestle with. But for me, particularly as I work with audiences or work with students, I'm trying to think, again, about this kind of pragmatic utopian vision of how do we get to coalition and how do we get to alliances. And part of what that is digging in underneath and thinking about what is this a reaction to, what is this resentment about, right? And part of what these people are reacting to, and I would actually say that the resentment goes far beyond, say, Bernie bros or something like that, and extends, say, to somebody like Michelle Alexander, who's been calling for for progressives to leave the Democratic Party and form their own alliance, right? And she's been doing this for quite some time, and probably did have an impact to some effect, right? Or when we say, I mean, in addition to, say, the Voting Rights Act, the Black Youth Project does find that young black men and women, millennials, right, are disaffected in the 2016 election because they feel like politicians as they exist do not speak for them, do not talk to them, do not engage them, right? And we actually really see this, right, with Mike Brown and Ferguson when Democrats do not, right, speak up for the rights of Mike Brown, right? And so I think you see, and I did some interviewing with people on the ground, particularly young millennials of color, and this is one of the things that they stressed over and over and over again, that they felt like these people that they had supported, these people that they were supposed to be in coalition with, weren't hearing them and weren't speaking to them. So what's the solution to that? You listen to them, right? You engage them. And I think one of the things that's much harder, particularly as we think about progressive politics, as we think about politics on the left, the assumption is there that there is a national alliance, that these are people who are speaking to our issues and that these are the issues that matter to these groups. But in fact, there's something that's coming out in polling, there's something that's coming out in the quantitative and the qualitative side of things that says there is a disconnect between leadership, between politics, and between ordinary people on the ground. And I think you have to be able to address this. Right? Whether or not you're angry, whether or not you're resentful, whether or not you say, this is just a bunch of, white guys sitting in a room mad about Bernie Sanders. Right? But, to this extent, Bernie Sanders mobilizes millennials, about 50% of millennials under the age of 30 during the primaries. That is something to pay attention to. Now, I'm not saying he's the leader or anything like that, but instead, what is it that they are attracted to? What are they responding to? I think on the issue, just very quickly, to the point of how do you engage people, how do you talk to people about Voting Rights Act, a number of these groups, including people right up here, have been doing that, right? I think Eric Holder's project on gerrymandering, for example, is committed to changing the narrative around gerrymandering among voting rights. And I think that it's kind of a natural thing to expose or to engage people about what the loss of rights means in something like the Voting Rights Act, right? Where the vast majority of people in this country understand at least what the Voting Rights Act means. Now, with that said, I think part of what the challenge is moving forward is it's actually relatively easy to mobilize people, right? So to get people, particularly with new networks, right, internet, right, it is far more difficult to organize them for the long term and for some kind of institutional change. So I think part of what you have to do actually goes to this point about engaging these people on the ground and actually speaking to, right, and showing people how these very big macro institutional and structural issues directly relate, right, to that lack of voice, to that lack of power that they're very angry about in their day-to-day lives.
You know, kind of toward your answer your question, I heard it said on the panel that part of being an American is about believing in these institutions, and I would push back on that a little bit. I think fundamentally being American is actually being suspect of these institutions. The idea of being American and being suspect of big government and big media. This is not a new concept at all. When you read the papers of our founders, none of that. This isn't the first accusation of fake news. Fake news has been around a long, long time, and I think that healthy dose of suspicion of institutions that exert enormous amounts of influence and power over public policy is not only quite American. I think it's very healthy. I think the bigger challenge, the greater challenge, is when you have politicians who don't respond. And I can't speak specifically about empathy from progressives. We've made progressivism, and we've made it a felony in Oklahoma. So I can't speak directly to it. But in all honesty, but we also had a lot of that on the other side too. I mean, that's not exclusive to the Democrat Party, and I actually had Dr. Rigueur and my study group. I'm leading a study group this session on minorities in the GOP, why we need each other. And in her discussion, talking about some of her work, is how non-voters actually punish candidates who they don't respond to. It's actually a punishment that you can read. There's a lot to be learned from the people who didn't show up and why. And so, and I think, and you contrast that to 2008 and 2012, when, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of energy around, the Democrat nominee. A lot of Republicans were excited about that candidate. And so I think a bigger challenge that we have than just, quote, the institutional challenges, I think it's finding men and women of integrity who can inspire people to think higher, like, frankly, President Kennedy did. I think that's a greater challenge that we have. And I agree, our primary systems and we can certainly, I think there's some room for improvement there. But a lot of it, I still believe that if you elect and nominate people who can inspire, and frankly, a lot of criticism can be cast, obviously, on the nominee on our side and our current president. But what he did do well was to communicate a message that was pretty universal. Now, he often got sidetracked from that message. But this idea that national security and, jobs, and also that we've got to be focused on fighting terror, we all kind of, I don't know a whole lot of people who disagree with that. That we certainly need to reform our immigration system, and we've talked a little bit about a broken system. There are broken systems in America, but Washington D.C. is not one of them. Washington D.C. is a well-oiled machine that is working exactly as it's designed to work and as it chooses to work in many regards. And so this idea of candidates who want to dismantle systems, that's certainly not a new concept in America, but the bigger question, I think, is for thoughtful people is, if you do that, what are we going to have? And is it going to be better?
So really briefly, I'll just say that our message, how do we get more people energized and engaged, is that we're reminding folks that we can't sit around and wait for the second coming. President Kennedy, Dr. King, President Obama are once in a generation types of people who come along. Every single leader is not going to be the most groundbreaking, charismatic, etc. But what we do know is that it's time for new leadership. We are working very hard at building a fresh bench. And so we are telling people to don't just march, but run. We need people to don't just march, run. Be the change that you want to see, and stand up and actually run for office and get rid of the people who you don't think are doing what they need to do. At the very least, let's challenge them, right? So much happens. Like you said, Washington is a well-oiled machine because most of the people in Washington don't get challenged. One thing the Tea Party did, at least, is said, well, you don't just get your job by default. We're going to come for you if we don't like you, right? So we're encouraging people to run for office, and we're seeing such a groundswell around this country of women, LGBT people, people of color, who are wanting to run for office now and who are getting trained. We are training people to actually stand up and to run at every level of government, from the school board to the United States Senate to governorships. So that's the one thing that is meaningful that we can tactically do and we can inspire and encourage other people to do, is actually be a part of the process. And specifically, I've been telling my Black Youth Project friends and my all of my folks who've been marching around BLM, Black Lives Matters, I'm saying, okay, well, the civil rights movement in the 1960s beget John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis. Beget the Morials in Louisiana, a very long time serving political family, and several others. Which one of you is going to stand up and run? Who's going to carry this legacy into the policy world and actually be at the table and make a difference? So let's not just march, let's also run. And then I'll say to you that what the subtext of the entire conversation around civil rights in the United States that we just have to have, and you alluded to this, is that this is a nation that's built on white supremacy. The fundamental core founding and values of this nation are built on white supremacy, white straight male supremacy, right? And that's, we have evolved over the hundreds of years, and it's beautiful, and we're all working towards growing. But the truth is that's still the subtext. And so that is going to constantly be something that we need to address and we need to figure out how to dismantle. I think it was Leah who actually said earlier that, it's hard to take, what did you say? You said something about like equality feels like oppression for people who've always had power, right? The story you told at the beginning when you're talking about people in Louisiana who at 18 years old could graduate high school and have no furthering education, but make $80,000 a year using their hands and buy a home, right? Like, these are folks who had a society that was constructed in a way that they assumed that, well, it is my privilege to be able to have this experience. And sadly, and I'm thankful for you all sending us Senator Elizabeth Warren and others who talk about this, sadly, there's an economic fallacy, a bill of goods that's still being sold to straight white men in this country that has really left them behind in a very sad way that I feel like nobody is courageous enough to tell them that their jobs aren't coming back, and courageous enough to tell them that maybe their ideas of what they could have with little effort is going to be the same. And so I cringed when I heard at the very beginning of this, and I wrote it down because it just made me cringe, that the strangers in their own land and this idea of line cutters really gets to me, because when I think about who these line cutters are who benefit from affirmative action, for someone working in a steel mill to suggest that the African American man who has 3 degrees, maybe probably 2, from Ivy League school like this, is a line cutter and not deserving. For immigrants to come here with nothing, fleeing their countries, and to build a life, may not necessarily speak the language when they get to a new land, and to build a life, right, with the grit and integrity and become educated and all these things to thrive. And a certain set of people say, oh, well, you just don't deserve, right? Really gets to me. And that's a real thing that we have to figure out how to address and understand. And I'm so thankful for you sharing with us really your truth, because understand that we aren't always the best messengers for everything. I know where I message well, and I know where I don't. And I would be perfectly honest, and I used to run the Congressional Black Caucus's Political Action Committee. So I started working in black politics before I went into gay politics. But I know that you probably shouldn't send me to Youngstown, Ohio, to have deep conversations about politics, because I know, how I resonate. And that's real too. And when I talk about needing a fresh bench, it's important that we amplify other voices, that we create leadership opportunities for other people, that we get to that, right? When we have more diverse voices in the conversation, then we can reach more diverse people. So that's important too.
So a couple of things. I think that as a couple of things. When I say that we believe in institutions, I don't think that it's because we don't believe in oversight. I think that we believe in oversight of those institutions. I think the problem right now is that there are folks right now that want to raise those institutions and don't have a plan B. And I think you might be a little uncomfortable because I have to share with you. So with TurboVote, we actually also launched, Voto Latino created a peer-to-peer application called VoterPal. And the idea is that we're trying to circumvent people that basically say how to make voter registration harder. In Texas, for example, you have to be deputized in order to register a voter. And in Oklahoma, there's an Oklahoma campus chapter where a young woman who is Latina registered 100 folks. So there are progressives in Oklahoma. So we'll chat later. But that's it. But I do think that I do think that there's a couple of things. I think that one of the things that we have to be very frank and transparent about is how political parties function. Political parties function with this idea of 50% plus one. We just need 50% plus one in order to win an election. Yeah. And so oftentimes they get to the 50% plus one and say, we are done registering voters. We don't need to include anybody else because then it gets too expensive. And this comes from both sides of the aisle. And our job is to register as many voters as possible. And there is a disconnect. And I think that when you start talking about what is that job of maximum participation, I do think that it is a tactic of both political parties not to maximize and register as many people, because all of a sudden you have constituencies that you may not have to be beholden of before all of a sudden you do. And that is a come to Jesus moment of who are we and what are our values when it comes to a democratic country. And institutions. And I think that what we're doing right now within this new Trump era, I thank him because for the first time, people are not apathetic. People are engaged, they are paying attention. My work is to get you impassioned with the political system. That is not the sexiest of things to do. But because people are feeling right now their backs against the wall, even people who voted for this president saying, wait, but that's not what I voted for. Now our job is to make sure that we are creating the avenues of engagement. And I sit on the board of Emily's List, and I can share with you that at Emily's List, since the election of this president, we've had 11,000 women wanting to run for office. Oh. By comparison, last year when it came to recruiting, it was less than 500. So this is not insignificant. And so the job is, so it's not, apathy is not the problem. Apathy is not saying now we're going to welcome you into the system, we're going to train you to run for office, but we're going to maximize you, make sure that you are registering, that you're participating, and that you're voting. And that is where Washington all of a sudden holds its nose, because they do not like that. And that is where gerrymandering is one of the things that we have to figure out how to deconstruct it, because it's not only unfair, it's undemocratic. I would also like to flag, when we talk about the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County versus Eric Holder, that basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court made the decision in 2013. Shelby County was the 5th largest county of Hispanic population boom. It was over 120% in the last census. Every single state and jurisdiction that followed had experienced at least 100% or more of a Latino population boom. It was, in my opinion, it was a strategic move to disenfranchise a future voter, because that doesn't mean that they're disproportionately of age. Our job is to ensure that we, again, go back and do the hard work and have an honest conversation of who is going to participate at the polls. We are right now living in an era where people say, well, you can get an ID, but then you close 600 DMVs overnight in Texas. So you're not making it accessible. It's a different type of Jim Crow. It's a different type of poll tax. The fact that young people or women, single women or the elderly have to stand in line for 6 to 8 hours to cast a ballot, that is a time tax. Who has the privilege of that? So we have to have a conversation and actually fix the structure to ensure that there's maximum participation. If we actually believe in this democracy, that it is equally access to all. And I think, and then finally, I would like to, everybody's like, well, where do we go now? I think where we go now is having the hard conversations with our neighbors. Why did the Bernie bros sit it out? One, I think the media was at fault because they said she was going to win anyway. Let's be honest, right? The other party had no idea. No, I was on election night, and Kellyanne Conway had just basically was backtracking, and you could clearly see that she was trying to find another job. Right? It was like, so nobody knew. That was one. But the other, but I think the other piece of the progressive movement was that there was this feeling from the, and this is the very first time that Republicans did not win white males by a majority. This was the first time that 10% of white males, of young white males, I should clarify, young white males were more progressive than the Democratic Party. It was double digits. That has never happened. So what that signals is that the Democratic Party never acknowledged this idea that there was an imbalance of their preference for the nominee. And until they can say that out loud and actually try to bring these folks together, the biggest challenge to the Democratic Progressive movement is a third party that will never be viable. But at the same time, the Democratic Party can never hold the White House. And it's not just true for young white progressives, it's true for young Latinos who are more progressive than their parents. And they need to figure out a way to ensure that they have I would argue that both parties right now are trying to find who their North Star is. And on the Democratic side, progressive side, it's making sure that you have folks that are more left of the left and how to bring them and coalesce.
Well, thank you very much. This is a great panel that brings out, I think, 3 enduring truths of the civil rights movement today. One is that these institutions aren't perfect and they require changing, and the second is that it's a lot of ordinary people